Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. Lots changed today, or at least some pretty new, different stuff, especially in the form of my website. It's from the very beginning, probably the first one I ever did of these months ago. I was saying, and wouldn't it be nice if you could all just look at these reports yourself? Because I have only, well, ideally 30 minutes is what I'm supposed to spend on these, but really it's almost always 50. But even in 50 minutes, I do not get to all the states or all the counties or all the countries. And so I wanted to make this available for anybody who wants to click through these same reports. And so I madly was working on that. I finally gave up on actually having it show up on the Joby Aviation site. It just wasn't happening. And so I made my own website and had to learn a whole bunch of stuff, and WordPress and web hosting and FTP and all these things, and figure out a way for my dashboards to push themselves to my website. But I have that now. And so now here on gregfarrar.us is my website. It is extremely simple. But it has here under COVID-19, it has those roughly the same things I've been showing you all along. So if I click on countries here, for instance, or if you click on countries, you'll see these same graphs. I haven't quite been able to make them full width on the screen, which is kind of annoying, but I guess it's okay, kind of, because my head's down in the lower left, taking up the margin anyway, and whatever. So these are a little bit smaller than they were, and maybe a little harder to see, but hopefully they're doable. If not, let me know. I still have the chat running, by the way, so drop me a message in chat. I've tried to put it in a place where I see it right away. There was some recent day where at the very end of it, I looked in chat and saw that somebody had dropped some cryptic number in there. 16 or something. It was you, Isaac. You know you did it, but I had no idea by then what it meant or what it had been a reference to, because I wasn't paying enough attention. But now here I am again, and I'm going to try to make my chat pop out at me a little bit. It's in a window that's behind the other window, and so it's easy for me to miss it. Anyway, let's get right into this. I will be using my own website now to present to these. It's really very much like how it always used to be when it was in a Databricks dashboard, but it's on my website. I think I'm going to see fewer failures of the graphs as well. This is my intuition, is that the failures that I've seen where the graphs will suddenly get empty and frowny faced in the upper left, that those were due to limitations of the Databricks dashboards. Databricks is awesome, by the way. That's what I use to do the analysis, but it does tend to get overloaded when you try to do too much in one notebook. So, starting from the countries, here we go. United States in total cases is, of course, way above everyone else still. Brazil, however, the past few weeks has been earning its reputation. It's had quite a bad reputation in the media as the worst, other than the United States, and probably the worst, even in some sense, even including the United States, because Brazil is growing and has not made, according to some, enough of an effort to control the epidemic. Now, as we'll see, Brazil is not as bad as you would think reading the headlines. This is why I'm here, because I'm here to look at some of these headlines and say, yes, this is true, what CNN or Fox News or whatever is saying, it's true, and there's more to the story. Yes, it's true that, for instance, the United States has the most cases and it's growing every day. Yes, it's true. Not the number of cases growing, but the total number is growing every day. And so you can look at this and say, oh, that's terrible. The United States is just terrible, terrible. But when you look behind the numbers, you realize the United States is shrinking every day in daily new cases, which is good. And you also realize the United States is not super high in the total number of cases once you adjust for population, and so on. And so on. So Brazil, yes, Brazil is certainly a trouble spot. And you can see these two dots that are slightly above the trend line is one of the hints we get that Brazil is doing even worse than some, because the dots being above the trend line suggest that it's getting worse. It's rising. And then we have Russia. Russia and the United States, you notice the dots are right on the trend line. So these are keeping a pretty sedate pace as far as growth goes. They're not growing fast. They may even be shrinking. We'll see. But still, Russia is the third largest. When you break down daily cases, Brazil actually has far more cases each day than the United States. The United States has just been at it for a much longer time, which is why the United States shows a lot more total cases. And then here's India, not Russia. I kind of expected it to be Russia because it was green, but now that now that each of my graphs has a different legend, the colors don't carry over anymore. But on the bright side, we do get things like India now showing up as number 3 in the legend, where before it wouldn't have been. And for this particular graph, those of you who've been here a while know I don't pay much attention to this graph. We'll see why in a minute. Well, I'll give you a spoiler. It's because it doesn't adjust for population. But by not adjusting for population, we do get some interesting facts here, like India is third in the world in total cases, even though India really has a pretty low rate of the disease per capita. But because they have such a large population, they're now over 100,000 new cases a day, which puts them not in the ballpark of Brazil and United States, but where the United States is dropping, India is rising. So if this continues, we may see a time when India takes second place. And then there's Russia, also obviously dropping, though slowly. And then there's Brazil, obviously rising and not all that slowly. This is one of my favorite graphs, though, the daily cases per million graph. This is adjusting by population. And so we don't see the United States anywhere evident in this graph, and you have to dig pretty far down, I think, to find it. Because though the United States does have more cases than anyone else, it has more population than most countries. And so when you actually look at the number of cases per million, the United States is fairly low. And I think the number of cases per million is a better metric than the total number of cases in terms of determining how well a particular country is doing. So who's doing poorly? Well, Qatar is doing poorly, as always. Qatar has been the worst in the world for some time in this daily cases per million, or DCPM metric. On the bright side, they have leveled out, at least. For the longest time, it was just up, 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 up for Qatar. Now, at least, they've leveled out. They've leveled out at a fairly appalling number. 650 is really very bad. It makes it a hot spot compared to the likes of New York, which really was one of the very worst in the world. I realized. I think I'll talk about that in a minute, because I've been saying untruths about Italy and Spain. Anyway, I will get back to there in a minute. And then next to Qatar is Bahrain. Bahrain is right next to Qatar, and so these are kind of the New York and New Jersey of the Middle East, where one of them infected the other, or maybe they're doing the same thing. Allegedly, it was the work camps, the oil work camps in Qatar, that really made things bad there. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Bahrain, which seems to be rather like Qatar, and I imagine has oil and certainly is very close to it, Bahrain also seems to have a growing problem. In fact, it has a growing problem in a way that Qatar doesn't. In fact, if you look at the latest mini trend, I'm just going to focus in on Bahrain. Well, what is this? We have a 0 there. If we ignored that 0 here, the mini trend here is suddenly sharply upward. We have a 750 as one of our most recent days. I don't know what that data point's doing. It's certainly wrong, but is it somehow, is this really twice as much because it included 2 days when this included 0 days? That could be. We don't pay much attention to individual data points, but when you start to see something like this, 2 might be a coincidence, 3 starting to get to be a pattern. So Bahrain is not looking good. I would even say it's the worst in the world right now. Even though its trend line is lower, the direction of the trend line is kind of terrible. Small, so it's not going to make a big dent in the world numbers, but if you were living in Bahrain right now, you might think about moving to somewhere else. I was, at least for a little bit. So this thing, I keep talking about DCPM, the daily cases per million, as my favorite metric, and saying, well, 500 is a hot spot. And I'm almost sure that I've said 500 like Italy and Spain used to be, and like New York used to be, and like New Jersey used to be. I think I have claimed in the past that Italy and Spain reached that 500 number. That I did an analysis just to kind of see if that was true, because I was really just speculating. And it really isn't. I was surprised to find that Spain never got above 180. Italy and Spain were absolutely the epicenter of Europe. And it never got above 180, and Italy never got over 110. So when I've been saying, I think I'll probably still continue to use the word hotspot for over 500, but by that definition, Italy and Spain were only ever warm spots. They never got to 500. We've seen quite a lot of 500 here and there. I mean, here's Qatar right now, and Bahrain certainly seems like it's going to get there. And it's totally plausible that Chile will too. So 500, but 500 is unusual. And it certainly didn't happen in the first wave of the pandemic in Asia. China hardly ever had any cases at all, and even South Korea was never. I'll check out their DCPM before I speculate, but I'm guessing they were also not that hard hit. But I had the impression that Italy and Spain were really terrible, and that Europe was really terrible. And relatively, that may be true, but the United States got it way worse. And I guess this explains why the United States remains far and away the leader in total cases, because the size of the United States and the size of Europe combined aren't drastically different, I don't think. I could be making that up too, but Italy and Spain are in the realm of 60 to 80 million, 60 million, 50 million, 60 and 50 million, and so they're not orders of magnitude off, especially combined from the United States, but they didn't have as many cases, DCPM, as the United States. So either you can look at this and say something that's 100 or 200 actually is really bad. I've been saying 200 is bad, or even something that 100 is something that 100 DCPM is really bad. We could say that 100 is really bad, or we could say Italy and Spain never really got bad. Italy had a terrible death rate, but I've focused my analysis on cases, and so from that perspective, Italy and Spain never got as bad as New York or some of these other places. I'm kind of inclined to bring my my metrics down a little. Maybe I'll start saying that, I don't know, 200 is a hot spot, but maybe I'll start saying 100 is a hot spot. Anyway, just keep in mind, at the worst, New York had 1,400 DCPM, way worse than I thought, actually. The worst day was 1,400 daily cases per million. New Jersey, 500. So those were hotspots even by my current definition. And if I were to drop the definition of hotspot down to 100, say, then they would be just white hot, blindingly hot, those two. And no one in the United States has gotten close since. Well, no one big. Rhode Island was pretty bad, getting better. All right, enough talk. So I will say then we have, no matter how you want to count it, 100 is still bad. I've been calling it a warm spot. All of these countries have pretty bad situations right now when it comes to coronavirus. They have more than 100 daily cases per million, and Saudi Arabia is closing in. Panama, Peru, Brazil, Oman, Armenia, Chile, Bahrain, Qatar. Those are warm to hot spots. And everyone else is much less than that, and I'll just point out, as I always do, the United States is rather far down there at 65. It's not in the lead in this metric because we have so many people, and it's dropping, apparently. It's getting a little iffy whether we're still dropping. But if you just look at this graph, we've been dropping for a while. We used to be at 84, then we dropped at a pretty steady pace down to about 70. We've dropped at a slower pace now down to 65. And now we have a whole cluster of new states bringing new cases online that are starting to compensate for the recovery of the first and second and third wave states. So anyway, I'm still, even no matter how you slice it, the United States as a whole is doing pretty well. It's not as bad as Italy ever was. It's not as bad as Spain, and it's really not as bad as the specific states of New York and New Jersey and Rhode Island and some other northeastern states, which had extremely bad time of this pandemic. So those are the hot spots. My other favorite graph then is the daily cases per million. No, that's not what I mean. It does mention daily cases per million. This is of those ones we just saw, the hottest countries in daily cases per million. How are they growing? Are they growing or shrinking? Growing or shrinking of just the hottest ones. And this graph doesn't look too good. Here's the zero line. Anything above the zero line right now is growing. Anything below the zero line is shrinking. As we can see, the hottest countries, the hottest countries tend to still be growing also. It would be great if we said, yes, all these 25 are hot in daily cases, but they're shrinking, like the United States is, for instance. Where is the United States here? Well, we'll see in a minute whether the United States is growing or shrinking. Generally, lately, it's just been around zero. So that's probably it right there. Yep, there's that line. That line right around zero, the most neutral of all these countries is the United States. It's right around zero, and it's not sloped upwards or downwards very much. It's just holding steady, but maybe slightly upwards. It on average, according to the trend line, is growing 0.3% per day. So it is not recovering right now, the United States as a whole. It is very slightly growing. We see a lot of these other ones near it that are recovering, that are they're near zero, but they're just crossing zero. So countries that are looking good right now that have been worse are Bolivia, Chile, interesting because of that Central South America cluster, Armenia, Brazil, interesting because of that Central South America cluster, maybe Mexico, barely trending downward, and Oman. But especially, it appears that we're kind of seeing the peak, I think, of the Central South America cluster. Let's look at that. Puerto Rico, I think, is pretty far out. It's interesting that gets thrown in as a country as well as a state. I don't know. Different data sources. Okay, are there other ones? Panama. Panama is troubled. Mexico. So when we look at the hottest of the Central South America cluster, and Brazil is really the poster child for this right here, we see that mostly they are growing. They're above zero, with the exception of Peru that's doing very well with a daily drop of 3%. Mostly they're growing, but they're all pointed downwards. Panama here is going to have quite a while to hit zero at that angle, but these other ones are practically there. Especially Chile is there. Chile had it pretty bad, and it's at zero. It is turning the corner right now. Even more significantly, given the news you hear, Brazil, it's only growing by 1%. Yes, that's not great, but it's only 1%. But more importantly, it's dropping, and it's been dropping. There goes Brazil. We can see, it's hard to see with this color, but it's very clear that Brazil, this trend line is accurate given the data points we have. Each of these data points is an average of 7 days, and Brazil was up in the 7 or 8% growth just 6 weeks ago. And now look at it. It's actually had its first day in the past week that's below zero. Its most recent 7-day period is negative. Barely negative, but it's negative. This point here, 0.3% drop in the most recent 7-day period in daily cases in Brazil. And so Brazil, I posted somewhere saying, looks like Brazil's getting better. And I got this, I wouldn't say a deluge, but a few people posted these mainstream media articles saying, Brazil's spiking and opening, and isn't this terrible? Well, I don't know where Brazil's going for sure, but I do think that it's an oversimplification to say that Brazil is spiking in cases. This suggests that Brazil is very soon, if the trend continues, going to turn the corner and start to see its cases drop. So whatever they're doing, they're doing well. They're doing a pretty good job of it. Their cases are on a They're still rising, but they're on a trend to drop, which is, you look at something like Bahrain, that's what we don't want to see. This is something that has a 7% daily growth rate, very high daily growth rate, and that growth rate is rising every day. So Brazil, I can't quite say they're doing well, but they're looking better. They're getting better. They're trending towards, I'd say when you cross zero, you're actually in a recovery. And so Brazil has almost reached recovery, which is awesome. Yeah, and let's go just look at the big picture of the world. All the countries of the world, are they growing or shrinking? This is very hard to make much sense of this graph because it's got so many threads in the rope. But the rope is broadly horizontal, so the world as a whole doesn't seem to be sharply angling upwards towards higher and higher growth. But I would say that most countries are probably growing. There's more above than below. Now the main group of the rope, from about 7% below to 7% above, is about even around this zero line. So there's this cluster, a big cluster of countries which are evenly above and below, which are balanced around no growth. But then we have this mini cluster here of the countries that are growing quite a bit faster. They're sort of the problem countries. And then we have Swaziland. Bringing in all the countries means that it's usually not particularly productive to point at particular lines here because they end up being places that we haven't talked about and that don't have much population and often don't have many cases. The fact that they're growing quickly doesn't mean they have many cases. If they had one case yesterday in Jordan, I'm sure they have more than that, but if they had one case yesterday in Jordan and now they have two, that's going to show up as 100% growth here. And so it doesn't mean much, which is why I prefer this graph, which is focusing on the, is why I prefer this graph, which focuses on the high daily cases per million. I don't know. It's not actually focusing on the high population. I'm always torn about whether to focus on high population countries or not. I have taken out from this graph some of the very smallest countries, and from this as well, therefore. To focus at least on the upper 90% of countries in population, so we don't get some crazy lines from some country that only has 3 cases. All right. Worldwide, well, here are our cases, daily cases, rising. It's not what we want to see here. This scale doesn't go down to 0 here, so be aware this is starting at 75, going up to 130 is less than a doubling over many weeks. So this is not a terrible line, but it's rising. And in keeping with that, here is the growth of the world. The world is growing, continues to be growing in cases at about 1% a day. Maybe that's slightly getting better, slightly trending downward. Most of the most recent data points are actually below this trend line, so they're pulling it down, and maybe the world is starting to turn back towards a downward angle, which would then point towards it hitting 0 sometime, and then that would be turning the corner towards negative growth. But right now the world is growing. The world is not, as a whole, recovering yet. Population tested. This is kind of all over the place. I think that I don't even know what order I'm sorting things anymore, because a week ago I redid all these. I think these are actually sorted by the most, the cases with countries with the most cases. The best countries in testing right now are Russia. Of those select poor few, Italy, Qatar. The United States is doing very well in testing. Trying to focus on just, of course it's number 1, that's why I can't find it. Yeah, all right, the data here is pretty flaky. We're having a lot of zeros, but these points are probably correct. The trend line probably isn't. The United States is doing maybe 7%, has tested 7% of its population. That's good. Daily testing, you have to zoom in to get anything useful here, but the countries that are doing best in testing per day are Russia and Qatar. According to this data, which is a little suspect, I'm not sure I quite believe it, because I think there'd be more above this 0.15 number. But according to this data, only Russia and Qatar are above the 0.15 number. I'm just going to move on to the states. On to the states of the United States. This, again, another tab on the website. You can look at this yourself. You can look at it right now. My use of it does not interfere with anyone else's use of it, so we can all be simultaneously zooming in on our favorite states, which is kind of awesome, because that's one of the things I think has been a real problem with my live stream, is I just can't cover what everyone listening wants to see. All I can really do are the top few, and then I start saying, well, I have listeners from Colorado and Texas and California, and I'll focus on those. But with this, you could literally, side by side, follow along here, and if you have a question, you can just pop over to the website, gregfarrar.us, and answer the question. And if you find something interesting, put it in chat. So, here are the states in total. We have this thing where a lot of them are below their trend line. The recent dots are below the trend line. That's good. That means they're slowing down. We know that New York is doing really well. New Jersey also doing really well. Illinois, maybe even better, how far it is below its trend line. It's really stabilizing. Massachusetts, I skipped over the green one for a reason. Massachusetts doing well, and others. Texas, maybe not. The one that isn't doing well is California, and we keep seeing this. California, way above its trend line, is just growing. California is, if I looked at this right now and just said, what's the worst state in this graph, I'd say California. Just on average, California is the worst state in the nation, because though they have more cases in New York, total, though they have more cases in New Jersey, everyone else is getting better, except for some little ones, which we'll certainly be talking about soon. California is the only state with a lot of cases that also isn't getting better. I'll look at Texas real quick, because I think it's another one. Yeah, Texas also outpacing its trend line, not getting better. Texas is growing. I'm going to skip that and just go straight to per million. I like the population adjusted numbers better. They let us compare the states. Now you look at this one, and you say, well, California isn't doing so bad. It's way down here at 25th. It's kind of in the middle of the pack, but maybe the low end of the middle of the pack. According to the most, I think the way I'm sorting this is I take the daily cases per million for a state for the past week, and I add those up, and then or average them, I guess you could say, and then I compare them across all the states. California's in the middle of the pack. We have Rhode Island looking a whole lot better. Rhode Island, which it was even worse than this, but now it's showing 300 as its peak. Rhode Island is now down to 23. It's no longer a factor. It will eventually disappear from this graph. For some reason, it's still kind of big. Yeah, Rhode Island's data is a little spotty too. But Rhode Island is I'd say a first wave state. New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, first wave states have recovered. I think it's worth emphasizing that. I bring this back a lot because I think people are missing this fact, which is that with very few exceptions, when a region, be it country or a state or a county, when a region gets this badly, it goes up, it goes down, and it never goes up again. We'll see whether Rhode Island comes back. We'll see whether there's a fall resurgence, but we see this over and over. There's just a rise and there's a fall, and it never comes back. There is something like an antibody response in a region, and it's probably literally the antibody response of the people in that region, but it might be something else. Maybe it's people get really, really afraid when they go way to the top, and suddenly they're the worst state, and then they start getting cautious, and they stay that way for a very long time. Maybe that's it, but the bottom line is, if you look at today's news, it's very grim about the United States. Stock market just got killed yesterday, and as far as no one ever knows why the stock market moves, but as far as anyone can guess, it's because people are saying, oh no, Arizona. And yes, Arizona has a problem, but Arizona is not a second wave. It's not a second wave in that sense. It's not like Arizona was all messed up in March, got better, and now we have a resurgence. Arizona is a third or fourth wave in the sense that it never had it, and all these other states got it, and they all got better, and now Arizona's getting it. As it sort of moves inward from the coast to the middle of the country, all these middle states are getting it, but they're just getting it later. And so I'm not really worried about Arizona yet. First of all, because it's not that hot. But even if it gets to be another 500 or another 1,000 in DCPM, it'll get over it, and then it'll be immune. There's something like an immune response that seems to happen to regions. And so I have not seen evidence from my graphs that suggests that the United States as a whole is going to go back into some terrible countrywide epidemic state. What's happening is the states are getting it one at a time. Nobody seems to be exempt, and once all 50 plus states and territories have had it up to the level of 200 or much less in some cases, then we will be done, I think. And then there'll be a vaccine, and then we'll really be done. So I wanted to look here. I wonder if I can see it better here. Yeah, so just to give a little more structure or support to what I was just saying. Here's Rhode Island. New York and New Jersey did the same thing. I don't have their graphs here because they've gotten so much better that they don't even appear in the top 25 anymore. They've recovered in almost completely. And Rhode Island soon will. You can see it's at the very bottom here. Rhode Island will be gone from this graph any day. But we had New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island. They were peaking in late March, early April, probably, and then they died away. Then we had, I'll just call it roughly Michigan. Then we had Michigan and friends. There are a few others you see there. Pennsylvania maybe. Louisiana. No, yeah, that's significant. Then we had Michigan and Louisiana. You can see those peaking. Not very high, by the way. They never got above 100, really, in mid-April. And now you look at them, they're heading downward. They're mostly getting better. Actually, I think Louisiana is trying to make a liar of me by showing a little bit of an upward trend again. Louisiana didn't have that sharp recovery. But broadly speaking, Michigan, Louisiana, second wave, they went up, they went down. And here is Michigan, absolutely at the bottom. Louisiana, more of an exception. Then we had the Illinois wave, let's call it. Illinois, Maryland, Nebraska, those peaked in May, and they're not all the way recovered, but you can see they have peaked and they are heading downward. Maryland's taking its sweet time to get back to, get down to zero, but it is coming around. And so there was that. That's sort of the third wave. You can visibly see them on the graph. Rhode Island looks like it's peaking here, and maybe it really did. I think of it as being together with New York and New Jersey, but it probably actually did come later. So it's its own wave, super high, super problematic, super recovered. And now we see, and let's just look at them, because boy is the news having fun with these ones. We're going to just start taking away waves until we just see the current wave. Actually, that may take time. I kind of know what the current wave is, so I'm just going to click on it. If you live in a state with the letter A, you're in trouble. We'll start with those. For whatever reason, coincidence? Yes, it is. Arizona, Arkansas, Alabama, Utah. The Carolinas are not looking so great. There might be a few others. Nebraska. If anybody else knows who knows a third, Georgia even? No, Georgia's doing all right. At least it's not in this wave. Okay, whatever. That's sort of part of it. So here are these states, and these are the ones that everyone's so worried about right now, and with some cause. These are states which are in the warm range, or as we saw, like this is in the range that Spain got to. So these are serious, fairly serious epidemics happening in these states, and they appear to be rising. Well, I'm going to look soon to see if they really are. They appear to be rising. I know that at least Arizona is really rising, and so there certainly anybody who said 2 weeks ago we're done, the United States is going to recover. No, well, now they should be adjusting their statements, because that's not true. There are continued growth of new cases in the United States, but none of these are super high. Remember, New York got to 1,400. This very worst one right now is at 120. It's got to get 10 times worse before we could say we've really had another wave like wave 1. And again, these are not the same states. These are different states. These are new states getting it, and as we've seen in every state that's ever gotten it, they've peaked and fallen off in a matter of weeks. So I'm gonna predict here. I may be wrong. I certainly could be, because we never know what's really going to happen. But I've seen a lot of these graphs now, and I've talked a lot about them. And I'm going to predict that all of these states will have reached a peak in the next month, and they'll be declining. Like 4 weeks from now. We'll see if we can, if I remember to check that. But it might be 2 weeks, it might be 1 week. But I think that by 4 weeks from now, we will have seen these ones peaked too, and we will have run out of states mostly. There won't be that many states at that point, with a lot of population anyway, that haven't already peaked and declined. So let's take a look at these states in growth rate to see what else do we have to worry about when it comes to them. Do we have, so all the states starting with A, coincidence? North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. Zoom in on these and say, how are you doing? The news is pretty bad. Certainly all of them are still rising, and this cluster here is really alarming. Tempered by what I said, it's relatively alarming. Arizona, Arkansas, and South Carolina all rising 8% a day in daily new cases. That's a very high number. We don't see above 5 very often. 8% a day. And this is the angle. Well, they haven't been going 8% a day, but they've been rising more and more. They're accelerating. So according to this, in a couple of days it will be 10%, a couple of days it will be 12%, a couple of days it will be 14%, and so it goes higher and higher. Now, again, we don't see states this high usually, and so I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit and say these states are not going to stay at 8%. They're going to start to, this graph will be the one that starts to level off first. We're not going to see 10, we're not going to see 20 there. We have first world medicine, we have contact tracing, we have test kits galore, and we have all the health workers that New York is willing to send them, that we should be able to, and I guess take another moment and say, they haven't had much time to notice this. 3 weeks ago, they were good. Arizona or Arkansas, at least. South Carolina, they were at 0. They weren't growing. They were looking at saying, okay, we got this under control. Suddenly in 3 weeks, they've seen a spike. So over the past week especially, I'm sure these states have been madly ramping things up, whether that be temporary hospitals, whether that be contact tracing, whether that be testing, or whether they're actually going to be putting in lockdown orders. The other thing they've been doing is they've been all over the news. And so anybody who lives in one of these states has got to be terrified right now. And on the one hand, I'm saying don't be terrified. It's fine. This has happened to all the other states. But on the other hand, nobody watches my live stream, and everybody looks at the New York Times or Fox or whatever, and all of them are seeing this alarming news, and they're going to stay in their houses. You can count on it. People are going to a much greater degree than 3 weeks ago, people are going to be voluntarily staying away from other people because they see that there's a terrible bug going around. So I'll put it all together. What are we going to see? I predict we're not going to see this for more than another week. I'm making predictions all over the place now, but a week from now, these three are not going to be at 8%. They're going to be, or maybe they'll be leveled at 8%, or leveled at 10%, but they're not going to be rising. This angle here is that this sharply upward angle is going to start to flatten out, because it always has. So that's my guess. And we'll see what happens. So all that said, we do have certainly a worsening. Absolutely. I don't mean to downplay the severity of what's happening in those states. They have about as bad as we ever see, which is 8% daily growth and accelerating. We also see in Nevada something similar. That's about it, just those 5. Those are the ones that have it bad. The rest are seeing, some of them are seeing, well, they're not growth hotspots. Those are the only ones that are close to growth hotspots. But we see a cluster of states here this is just the hottest ones in daily cases. We see a cluster that are horizontal, which means they're but above 0. They're growing, but at least they're not accelerating. And then we see the earlier waves getting better. Notice again, New York and New Jersey are not here. They're not here because they don't have any cases, relatively speaking. They're in the bottom 25 in new cases after adjusting for population. And so they're not even here. They're doing so well, they're not even here. Notice also that Colorado isn't here. Similar thing. Colorado is in the bottom 25 in new cases adjusted for population. California, though, I haven't been talking much about, and I really am going to focus on that in a minute because that's my next tab. I'm certainly running through my time here, so I probably won't spend too much time on California today. But California is one of those steady but not getting worse or not getting much worse. There's a slight upward trend to California. It's at about 2%. And all these other ones are the first wave states, Virginia, or first and second, Iowa. Actually, I don't know what those really are first wave states. I thought I was going to see things here. There's Illinois. I thought I'd see Michigan here. But anyway, there are a bunch of states that are getting quickly better. And there are a bunch of states that are getting slowly better, like Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Washington. All these are getting better. If we look at the big picture of all 50 states, again, I'm not going to focus on these because there's too much here. Broadly speaking, about as many are getting better as are getting worse, and there's also a triangular shape to this, a fraying of the rope that we often see, which is just kind of the way the outliers work, where we have a pretty even spread across the range of percentages here. And those that are worse tend to be getting worse faster. Those that are doing really well tend to be getting better faster. We see this fanning out here, and then it tends to come back together. A thread that's heading up here tends to flatten out and head back to 0. There's kind of a regression to the mean happening here, and the ones that are doing really, really well also tend to flatten out and head back to 0, but not usually cross it. Whereas the ones that go up and head back to 0 usually cross 0, turn a corner, and start to get better. But right now, this is definitely a mixed bag. We have about an even number of states getting better and getting worse. As a whole, as we saw in the previous tab, the United States is not recovering. It's not clearly in recovery. It's slightly getting worse because we have quite a number of states that didn't really have this badly before that are catching it. I'm going to skip testing because I'm low on time here. Testing is generally looking quite good everywhere. California counties. I'm going to go into California. So as we saw, California is not doing great. It is showing, I think, a 1% growth is what it was doing. I'm not going to go back. 1 or 2% growth in daily cases. Not yet on a clear recovery trajectory. I'm also going to just zoom straight to the daily cases per million, where we can see, before I zoom actually, if I can make it not zoom. No, it's going to zoom. I'll unzoom. I'll just say there are still these 2 crazy counties, Imperial and Kings. Kings is looking almost as bad as Imperial if you look at this scattering of ridiculously high dots. Recall 500 is hot, and by my recent calculation, maybe even super hot. 500 is hot. We're seeing in recent days thousands, low thousands, 2,400, 2,500, 1,300, 1,700, 2,500. Both of these counties are extremely high in their number of daily new cases per million. They're small counties. They don't contribute that much to the state, but wow. Kings and Imperial just keep showing up on this graph. Los Angeles, much more significant in terms of the numbers it contributes to the state. Also not looking great, where we see something like Tulare, which leveled out and headed downward. And I guess that's true as well. We can see it in Riverside. It seems to be leveling out and heading downward, or at least heading horizontal. Not so Los Angeles. Los Angeles is looking pretty bad. San Bernardino also, and Kern. These aren't even warm by my definition, but the angle they're headed is not the angle we'd like them to be headed, and Marin as well. So a week from now, these could be real problem spots. Right now, at least they don't have a lot of cases. But Los Angeles, at 130 cases, it's warm for sure, pushing its way into hot maybe. So the question is it growing or not? Mostly we can say what the state's going to do by its total numbers just based on what Los Angeles is doing, because it has so many cases and so many so many total cases. What is Los Angeles doing? Well, at least it's stable. It's growing, but only at a very small 1%. For a while there, it looked like it might be in trouble, but now it's seen a lot of days that have shrunk. Each one of these is a 7-day average of a week. So this week, the week ending this day, 2% drop. The week ending this day, 4% drop. The week ending today, 1% gain, and yesterday was about steady, and a couple days ago was 2%. So it's holding steady at about 1%, which is why California as a whole is holding steady at about 1%. The growth hotspots, though, if you look at this graph, these are the hottest counties. They're almost all rising. California is still looking pretty bad by this graph. Here's the zero line. The only thing that's below zero is Solano, Fresno, San Diego. Actually, that's good news. I was going to say that most of the counties were pretty small below zero, but at least San Diego has just cracked zero and is starting to shrink a little bit. But everybody else is not only growing, but generally accelerating. These upward lines suggest that the counties of California are getting not just more and more cases every day, but they're having a higher and higher growth rate every day. Yesterday they had 7%, today they have 8%. And we have some pretty high numbers here. Contra Costa, Stanislaus, Merced, Monterey. There's that Monterey again, really trying to be trying to make the news. Monterey wants to be famous, and it's kind of managing it. 8% growth per day and accelerating. Monterey, relatively small county, but dear to my heart as the neighboring county to Santa Cruz, where I normally live. Santa Cruz looks rather good. We'll just take a look at Santa Cruz because I know people like it. Again, you can always come here any day. I'm going to try to update this every day. The data sources only update every day, so I can't do more than that. I'll try to update it every day, and at the very bottom of the page, by the way, there's this little thing that says last updated. This thing here will tell you when it was last updated. Updated today. Here's Santa Cruz County. Sad to say, it is not one of those few that's shrinking, but at least it's only growing at 2%. Not looking great in Santa Cruz right now, but nothing's looking great in California. There are very few happy places in the California graphs right now, except the testing, which is great. But yeah, that's not a good graph. We would like to, and in the past, even California, in this very series of live streams, we have seen California look much better than this. You can see even back in early May, California was at least kind of centered around the zero line. Now it's almost entirely above the zero line. More and more cases every day, and each day most counties have even more new cases than they had the previous day. Their growth rate is accelerating. So don't know why that is, but it is. That's the truth about California, the sad truth about California right now. I will briefly show the testing, percent tested. San Francisco has tested almost 10% of its population. Fresno, 3% is the worst. Both of those are pretty good numbers. Daily testing, a lot of daily testings looking well. Actually, it doesn't look that great in daily testing. This 0.15 number that we'd like to see everyone above, and there are only a few above it. But the total numbers are good, at least. We'd like to see a lot of these counties ramp up their testing, and hopefully they will. Yeah, that's the news. On the California level, the news is, I wouldn't say it's grim because California doesn't have that many cases yet, but if it keeps going this direction, it's going to turn grim. At the states level, let me remind myself, what was the news at the states level? At the states level, daily cases per million. The big ones have recovered. That's right. The news at the states level is that cluster of states, many of which start with A, all growing fast. Not yet with a huge number of cases per million, but growing fast. So the state level is also looking worrisome, but not yet New York worrisome. And at the country level, we have the recovery in Qatar, but that doesn't help much. And then we have the recovery of Central South America, which is starting to look good. So yeah, actually the countries are looking a little better as on the whole, but still most of these, the countries graph is kind of centered around that zero. There are a lot of countries still growing, a lot of them shrinking, and about half and half. So the news is mixed at the country level, maybe a little better than mixed at the state level, and pretty bad at the level of California. That's the news. Thanks for watching. I'll keep doing these because obviously the news continues to come in and we are not out of this thing yet. I'm Greg Farrar. Check out my website at gregfarrar.us where you can get all these same graphs that I've just been using here. I think I can do blogs here, though I'm not right now. And assuming, I mean, WordPress is a classic blogging tool, so I know I can do blogs here, but whether I do or not remains to be seen. But it would make a lot of sense for me to take my Facebook text versions of this that I've been putting out every other day and put them on this website. So I probably will do that tomorrow. If you look at the website tomorrow, unless somehow I just don't have time for it, you will probably see a text version, a textual report of countries, states, and counties of California. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar.